In this video, I'm going to make a shelving unit for my brother to hold his record collection. He recently bought some mid-century modern style furniture and he's been looking for something in a similar style to hold his record collection, but he hasn't been able to find anything the right size, so he asked me if I could make something for him. He wanted the unit to be 1 meter wide and have 2 shelves, each with some section dividers in the middle. And it needed to sit around 16 centimeters off the floor level so that it would sit above the power sockets on the wall where it's going to be placed. So I did a drawing in SketchUp and this is what we came up with. As shelves full of records are quite heavy, there'd need to be a leg frame assembly with apron rails to support the weight, and I designed the unit so that the section dividers would also help to support the shelves and prevent them from bowing over time. The side panels would be tapered to add a bit of visual interest, and the back panel would be green in colour to complement the wallpaper in his room. For materials, I have some of this Sapele veneered particle board, and I have 7 of these pieces, which should be enough to make the whole unit, apart from the legs, which will be solid Sapele. Each long side has a veneer applied, but the top and bottom of each panel do not. I want this to be the front edge of the side panel, so I need to retain that veneer. And I'm going to set my protractor to 7 degrees, which is the angle I used on the drawing. And I'll make a mark. And then I'll extend that line using a ruler. With my protractor still set up, I can line it up with the end of that mark and make another line. And now I need to extend that line too. I want the height of the side panel to be 720 millimeters, and I can't hook my tape measure on the edge of the board because that cut hasn't been made yet, so I'm just going to line up 100 millimeters with that line and then make a mark at 820 millimeters. I find that's a more accurate way of doing it because it's difficult to line up the 0 at the end of the tape measure with that line. To mark up the bottom of the side panel, I'm going to use my speed square, and then I can offer up my protractor and move it until I'm lined up with the mark that I just made, and then I can mark up that angle, and then I can extend that line too. Now I just want to take some reference measurements to make sure that my markings are accurate, so I'm going to position a framing square level with that line up my tape measure at 100 millimeters with this mark, and then make sure that the measurement on this side is 820 millimeters, and it is. So I know now that my markings are accurate and this side panel is ready to cut. I positioned the marked up side panel onto another piece of the same material so that I could cut both of the side panels together for consistency. But before making the cuts, I first applied some masking tape to where the cuts would be made to help prevent tear out of the material on both pieces. I set the cutting depth on my circular saw to just over the thickness of the 2 pieces, and then I could make the cuts following the lines that I'd marked up. I made these cuts freehand, just being very careful to keep close to the line. When I peeled off the tape, I found that the masking tape had helped to keep the cuts nice and clean. Next I wanted to cut a bottom and top panel, so I first measured the width of the tapered side panels at both the top and the bottom. I ripped the bottom panel to the right width at the table saw, and then went to rip the top panel to the right width, but realised that the material was not wide enough. But that was an easy fix. I just marked up a line at the back of the side panels 30 millimeters in from the edge, set up a straight edge with some F-clamps and ripped them down to be slightly less wide so that I could use the full width of one of these pieces of chipboard as a top panel. This did mean that I needed to rip a little more of the bottom panel too. To cut the top and bottom panels to length, I used my panel sled on the table saw as these boards were slightly too wide to cut at the miter saw. You can see here I'm using a weight just to help hold the board onto the sled without it moving around. This here is the bottom shelf, and I want to add 2 evenly spaced section dividers here, and they will not only divide the records but also support the shelves above it. First I'm going to set my combination square to the thickness of the material and then lock it down. Then I can make a mark on each end of the shelf to represent where the side panel will be. Then I'm going to measure the distance between the two lines that I just made, and that's 961 millimeters. So if I divide that by 3, I get 320.3. So I want my section dividers to be that distance apart. So now I can line up 100 millimeters on the tape measure with the line and make a mark at 420.3 millimeters. And I'll do that on both sides. And the marks that I just made represent the center of the section dividers. And if I make a mark 7.5 millimeters on either side of that mark, that represents where I want to cut a housing joint to accommodate the section dividers. So this should now measure 15 millimeters wide, and it does. What's up? I want my section dividers to be 190 millimeters in width, so I'll set my combination square and then I can mark up a stop line. Unfortunately, I don't have a 15 millimeter wide router bit, but I do have a 12 millimeter one, so I'll need to make the cut in 2 passes. Next, I'll measure the distance between the cutting edge of the router bit and the edge of the base, and that is 38 millimeters. So now I've made another mark 38 millimeters away from the housing joint. And finally, I want to set the cutting depth of the router bit to 5 millimeters. And now I can line up my speed square with the mark that's 38 millimeters from the joint and make a cut with a router. Now I need to mark up 3 millimeters in and make another mark, and now I can make a second pass. And now the section dividers should be able to slot nicely in place. I squared off the ends of the housing joints using a chisel, and they were a really nice fit. And then I could route the next joint in the same way. Next, I ripped another piece of the veneered chipboard to the width that I wanted the central shelf to be, and I cut it to length at the miter saw. The miter saw didn't have quite enough reach to finish the cut, so I finished it off with a handsaw. I could then mark up for 2 of the dividers to the central shelf and route them out in the same way as I had for the bottom shelf. Then I could start assembling the unit. I started by securing the bottom panels to the side panels. I applied wood glue and used some masking tape just to make cleanup of any excess glue easier. I used some corner clamps to hold the pieces in place, and then I drilled pilot holes with a countersinking bit through the bottom panel and into the side panels, and added some screws. I could then flip the unit upright and remove the tape. As the side panels measured 720mm in length, I divided that by 2 to get the positioning for the central shelf, and then marked it up. I'd used some of these metal angle brackets to help support the shelves. I picked lots of these up at a car boot sale recently. In hindsight, I wish that I had chosen to route out some more housing grooves in the side panels to hold the central shelf. I think that I was just worried about doing that because this material is so thin at around 15mm, and I didn't want to compromise the strength of the panels. Anyway, I think that would have been a better option. Not that there's anything wrong with using the brackets, they will do the job just fine, and also they won't be very easy to see because they'll be below eye line, and also once the unit is full of records, they won't be visible anyway. I drilled pilot holes and screwed in the brackets using a speed square to keep them straight to one another. After applying some glue, I could fit the shelf in place using a sash clamp to get a nice tight joint, and then secured the brackets to the underside of the shelf. Next, I measured up the distance between the section divider housing groove and the top of the shelf so that I could cut the section dividers. I ripped another piece of the material at the table saw to the width I wanted the dividers to be, and by flipping the board over between cuts, I could retain each of the veneered edges for what would be the front of the dividers. I set up a stop block and cut the dividers to length. I added more angle brackets to what would be the top of these dividers, and then I could apply glue to the joint and knock the dividers in place with a mallet before securing the angle brackets to the shelf above. Then with the unit upside down, I could secure the top panel using glue and more brackets. And I could then secure the section dividers for the central shelf in the same way as I did before.